In our handprint care work with teachers, what we've been looking at is how did human activities and climate shape the early agroecological landscapes of southern Africa, looking back to try to understand the challenges of the present in terms of the past. And centuries-old heritage of landscape change is evident in southern Africa, where the diverse southern African plateaus and lowveld might best be described as a heritage landscape. We often today think of these as natural landscapes, but heritage landscapes emerged within the natural systems of forests and savanna grasslands, which evolved with successive nomadic and migratory cultures over thousands of years. And there's a lot of evidence for this now. The earliest people were nomadic, gatherer hunters, many of whom followed the seasonal migrations of animals. Small stock and cattle people arrived in waves of southerly expansion over hundreds of years. Cattle people also practiced shifting agriculture that opened up the woodlands, and they used fire to expand the grasslands for their herds. Chitimeni agriculture or slash and burn agriculture, for example, opened up the forested areas and is still found in northern Zambia as a sustainable practice in cycles of 18 to 20 years, because custom requires people to return to the lands of their birth to marry. So there's a lot of richness in terms of the sustainable landscapes that developed as people tamed the land in Central and Southern Africa. Landscape change was slow, a very slow process, and early migrations have been described in the folklore as taming of the lands, because the heritage practices of shifting agriculture and pasture management with fire expanded the grasslands, providing fodder for cattle and for wild animals, as well as pushing out the habitats of tsetse fly and keeping the tsetse fly at bay from cattle. So if we look at a picture of this and take a village homestead surrounded by expanding grasslands and the woodlands being transformed, you have got cattle, you have got the daily life of using material and dumping it, and you have got the arable lands. And so what happened was imifino gathering, that's the gathering of wild spinaches, the use of fire, hunting and grazing, created these landscapes through a process of taming the land, expanding agroecological cultural landscapes right throughout and reaching down into southern Africa. Today it's still possible to read the natural landscapes as an outcome of the interactions of people and nature over centuries of cultural expansion. And if we take an example of this in a curriculum topic of heritage landscapes and conservation, there's a concern today about land degradation. So tuning into this requires us maybe to start with a story. And the story that I'd like to share with you is a story that Titch Pess and I told me when we were watching some animals in a nature reserve as they walked out of the forest towards a waterhole. Titch pointed out how cattle grazing in the rich grasses under the tall trees, the trees provided shade in the summer months to these cattle before losing their leaves in the winter when the cattle needed warmth. The thicker and less palatable grasses in the veld could be burned to open up the landscape and to provide rich fodder for the cattle whenever there was a shortage of grazing. The woody undergrowth was cut for firewood and left to dry in the winter months, after which some was burned to prepare croplands at the onset of the summer rains. The heat of the ash would help control pests as well as provide nutrients for sorghum and other crops that people grew. Titch in this way noted how cultural landscapes are now at risk owing to changing practices and the necessary demand for more and more land for commercial agriculture to feed growing populations. And this brings us challenges to find out more, maybe to find out how early culturists changed the landscapes to make them habitable and how these landscapes are changing today. Also to work out and deliberate how agroecological landscapes might best be conserved. It's not just a matter of nature conservation, but they are cultural landscapes. And then, of course, action taking. What sustainable food production practices are good for people and nature that we can try out and use today? And here are some references and materials that might be useful to you.